Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Matt Malone. I'm the Head of Outreach for Beyond Autism. And hopefully you are here to attend my webinar today for Working to Prevent Exclusions, a supportive framework. So just a couple of things to say off the bat. Hopefully, I understand some people might be joining us on their lunch break. So as you're getting settled, I'll try and set the table for the day. This is my first lunch and learn as a member of the team at Beyond Autism, but I know that there's lots of you who attend these lunch and learns regularly, so I do hope that I do justice. But of course, if at the end of this there are questions you feel that you haven't been answered, then there is going to be a question and answer session at the end. I won't be addressing those questions throughout the presentation, but if you put them in the chat, then my very helpful colleague Jake is going to collate them for me so that I can address them all at the same time at the end of the session. And if I can't address them at that time, for any reason I don't get round to them, or if I don't necessarily have that information, I will certainly do my best to respond via email to anyone who has a pressing concern. Because I do recognize from my history, which I'll talk about in a moment, that exclusions are a very serious and emotive topic. So there may be those of you in attendance who feel very strongly and would like some advice and guidance on specific areas. Given that I've only got half an hour to present some strategies and assessments of how this situation has arrived, there will be, it'll be very brief. I will not be able to go into much detail, but at the end we'll be sending links to our resource hub and also a link to arrange to meet with myself or my team to discuss situations more specifically, should that be necessary. So with all of that said, just a couple of other caveats really quickly. So I am doing a very broad sweep here. Exclusions, whether they're permanent exclusions or other types of exclusions, have lots of causes. I'm focusing predominantly on SEND today and the link between SEND and exclusion. There's a really useful report which I will link to in one of the slides about causes of exclusion. And there are other factors that contribute to exclusion other than unmet need in SEND. But given the nature of my role and my experience, that's what I'll be focusing on today. And just another note to say that I will make briefly some notes and aspersions towards legislation and guidance, and the role of exclusions in education is supported and underpinned by relevant legislation and guidance. And whilst I'll speak to some of those documents, this shouldn't be taken as a definitive representation. And if you are a parent or an educator who is in a position where there's an exclusion that you are dealing with, I would strongly recommend that you take a look at the publicly available guidance yourself, rather than taking what I say today briefly as gospel. But with all of that said, let's get into what we're going to talk about today. So, objectives of the session are to explore the links between SEND and exclusion and try and support everyone here to understand some of the key issues and potential strategies and alternatives to exclusion. I'll do an introduction as to who I am and why I have relevant experience in this area and what my team does. I'll also do a very quick look at data. I will be referencing that the current data that we have on exclusion, what it does tell us about the links between SEND and exclusion, and also I'll talk a little bit about what it can't represent. I'll briefly look at the common causes of permanent exclusion and self-exclusion, definitions to be provided shortly, and a note on the process and guidance around how to support students who are at risk of either of those. I'll then get into some of the strategies to support that I've implemented over my years in education, broadly broken down into ensuring that there's an assessment and identifying the needs of young people who are at risk of exclusion, looking at the environmental causes and factors that might be contributing, looking at school policy and reasonable adjustments. And if you're not an educator, this phrase might mean nothing to you, but if you are, ordinarily available provision, which is the kind of catch-all phrase for quality first teaching. What should we be doing in our classrooms as standard to support all learners which can help reduce the risk of exclusion as well. I will then do a little bit of a dive into what the alternatives are when the risk of a permanent exclusion is imminent, because there are situations where that does arise, and there are other things that we can look to do in those moments, in my experience, to try and avoid a permanent exclusion, but still try and satisfy the needs of the situation. I'll try and summarize everything that I've said at the end there, and then there'll be a time for questions and answers. So like I said, at any time, if anything I say prompts a question for you, please do just pop it in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to those at the end. Right. So introductions. So who are Beyond Autism outreach team, and who am I? So if this isn't your first Lunch and Learn, you'll know that Beyond Autism is a charity. It's in its 25th year. It's existed to try and promote and deliver expert quality behavior analysis led approach to provision for young people with ASD. We have ASD settings, specialist schools that provide that. But my job as head of outreach, and I've been head of outreach for 6 months, is to try and take that approach, take the strategy, skills, expertise, and knowledge, and to support everyone else who is supporting and in contact with young people with ASD. So that could be mainstream schools, alternative provision providers, parents, carers. It could be a wide range of people. My job as outreach, our job as outreach, should I say, is to try and support what we know, bring what we know to those settings, so that wherever a young person is who has ASD or is on the spectrum, they're getting the best possible provision they can. So just a quick introduction to my team from left to right. We have Hannah, Rachel, Carrie, and Cynthia, who are my fantastic team of behavior consultants who do the direct work with schools, settings, and other stakeholders around that. So my experience, really brief nutshell, just so you know where I'm coming from and why I have any kind of interest in exclusions. So I was very fortunate to start off my career in education about 14 years ago as a teaching assistant in a special school, a wonderful special school in West Sussex called QE2 Silver Jubilee School. And that was my first experience of SEND as a teaching assistant on the ground supporting young people. Migrated to qualify as a teacher, worked in special schools, worked in mainstream schools, worked in various levels of management, and found my way to work for a local authority. And for the last 4 years, up until I took the role as head of outreach, I was working for local authorities to support with delivering of EHCP provision in schools, supporting young people who didn't have a school to go to but had special educational needs. And most recently, I spent time trying to support and prevent permanent exclusions where possible. So my career has hopefully informed me in a variety of ways in terms of what provision supports young people to do well, but also what the alternatives are when things aren't going well and how we can best address those. In terms of that last question, who you are and what you take from this, I'm aware that we may have parents in attendance, we may have carers in attendance, we may have a range of stakeholders with experiences and interests. I will do my best to make sure that the information I am delivering isn't too focused to any one cohort. But yeah, just apologies if that does come across. This is exclusion is something that affects everybody. If a young person in your family is excluded, it's going to affect that young person. It's going to affect that family. It's going to affect the educators who've issued that exclusion. It's going to affect the educators that go on to support that young person after that exclusion. So really, there's nothing in today's slides that should be irrelevant to anyone who is interested in this area and is interested in young people having their needs met. So yeah, but with all that said, let's move on to what we are here to talk about. So what is an exclusion? So when people hear the word exclusion, they quite often think of the most significant form, which is a permanent exclusion, but essentially it's the opposite of inclusion. Exclusion is not being included. So that could be a permanent exclusion where a educational setting has said, we are no longer able to support this young person for whatever reasons for the rest in perpetuity. Our relationship is now over, which is an incredibly difficult conversation, decision, and event for all involved. There could be a fixed term exclusion, sometimes called a suspension. But also included in here, I categorize as self-exclusion. So where we have young people with special educational needs who don't have their needs met, they may be self-excluding through a range of ways, including emotional-based school avoidance, poor attendance, and a variety of other things that I'll go to in later slides. So I just wanted to say that all types of exclusion are of a concern, certainly to me, to Beyond Autism, to our team, and I'm sure to all of you listening. And reducing placement breakdown, reducing the risk of those exclusionary outcomes, whether they're self-exclusion or school exclusion, is really what we're about here at Beyond Autism and the outreach team. You know, we're striving to be as inclusive as we can and to support other educators to be as inclusive as they can. So that's a brief introduction as to what I'm going to be talking about. As I said, I'll now look a little bit at the data, but not in too much detail. So the graphic on the left is something I've lifted from the Institute for Public Policy Research, Who is Losing Learning Report 2024. It's a really interesting report if you're interested in this area. And as I said earlier, some of the other factors that go into increasing the risk of exclusion for a young person are detailed in that report as well, but I'll be focusing on SEND for today. So some sad data on the right here. I'm not going to read it all off verbatim, but as you can see, children with SEND support and children with EHCPs are across the board more likely to have permanent exclusions, fixed term exclusions. They're more likely to end up in elective home education or more likely to have persistent or severely absent outcomes. Now, just a caveat to elective home education, in case there's any elective home educators on here, clearly there are families that elect to home educate and have a very successful time of it, and they have a philosophy and a curriculum that they want to deliver. But there are families increasingly that are reporting that they're electing to home educate because they feel that their young person's needs aren't met in an educational setting. So the reason why we're including that in terms of self-exclusion is because it represents essentially a young person's needs who haven't been met and a relationship that's broken down and a failure without blame or judgment on the situation that has not resulted in positive attendance, engagement, and well-being. So if you look at that graph, you can see that exclusion isn't just one thing. It is gradations. It represents a range of outcomes. And the reason I include this graph, if you're an educator here looking at this, you will recognize some of these things. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who gets a detention is going to end up permanently excluded, but it is a sliding scale, and it is a flag that brings our attention, hopefully, to something that we need to address. What has happened? If a young person has had a detention and an internal exclusion, a suspension, or in the means of self-exclusion, a young person is persistently late, is taking additional toilet trips, perhaps without necessary cause, or truanting, or is having persistent absence. These are all things that should lead us to ask questions around what is the cause of this young person not receiving their right to education in that time and place. So that's a brief overview of what I mean by exclusion, what I have in my mind when I'll be talking about exclusion in the next slides. I'm sure you have questions around some of the details there. I look forward to addressing some of those later on. So just a very quick note on the process. If you are a parent who is, I know I've spoken and I've worked with many parents over the years who have been part of the exclusion process and have found it very challenging. So I'm just going to rattle through some of the key points about an exclusion process. And by this, I generally mean permanent exclusion, but I'm not going to go into much detail. Number one, head teacher retains the authority. The head teacher can issue a permanent exclusion. They have that right to do so. Even if a young person has an EHCP, they can do that. And that's sometimes a misconception that parents have. Should they call an annual review to be saying that they can't meet the needs of that young person with an EHCP before they permanently exclude? That would be, in my opinion, yes, they should have done that. But it's not necessarily, it does not mean that they cannot issue that PECS. They are, however, due to the guidance and legislation, SEN code and practice and the exclusion guidance, you cannot exclude for not being able to meet need. So if just because you feel that you can't meet the special educational needs of that student does not mean that you can permanently exclude them. And if that should not be the reason that you permanently exclude, and that a school has exercised that power. After an exclusion, the head teacher does have the power to rescind that exclusion. If the exclusion is rescinded and they have found an alternative, then clearly the young person should be welcomed back to school at the earliest possible opportunity, and a plan of supportive transition is something that should then be implemented at that time. So there are broadly two kinds of exclusion, permanent exclusion. There's persistent disruptive behavior. There's where young people have been recorded as having a history of breaking behavioral policy, and the head teacher has taken the decision to make that permanent exclusion. And then sometimes there's a one-off incident which the head teacher feels has created a situation where they can no longer ensure the education and safety of other young people in the setting, and take the decision to permanently exclude. Now, regardless of if you have a young person who's excluded in either of those situations, what steps have been taken to meet that young person's special educational needs should be clearly evidenced and be part of the discussion. So if you have an EHCP, as I mentioned, then and you weren't able to meet that young person's needs, you need to be speaking to your local authority and the EHCP authority that has issued that to talk about that as early as possible, to avoid these types of outcomes where young people don't have access to education. I like to categorize exclusion into emerging and imminent. So perhaps if you think about the graph that I just shared, we might have an emerging risk of exclusion where a young person is having repeated fixed term exclusions or repeated detentions, or a young person's is displaying behaviors that are cumulatively showing us that there is something going on for that young person that isn't working for them in their educational setting. So identifying as an educational setting where your emerging risks of exclusion are is so vital, because early intervention is so key to making a difference in these situations. An imminent risk of permanent exclusion might be something where there has been a severe incident, there's been some sort of violent behavior or physical interaction between two individuals that is putting a head teacher in a position where they have to make a decision about the safety of the individuals involved. And the imminent risk of exclusion tends to be associated with that one-off incident. And I'll talk more about the potential strategies we can look to about that in the future. Just really quickly, the process after that is the governing body should meet to review the decision to exclude. And at that time, they should review the support that has been put in place for that young person's additional needs. Then if the governing body uphold the exclusion within 15 days, sorry, I should have said the GRC should take place, the governing body should meet. As a parent, you have a right within another 15 days to ask for an independent review panel to look at that decision and verify and ratify if the governors have upheld your young person's rights against the legislation in protection. You also have the right during those process, during the GRC and the IRP, to request an SEN expert from the local authority to come and support you with assessing how the school has done in that educational setting. And if you're an educator, that's something that you should be aware of, and you should be ensuring that your documentation is up to date, so that when you have those conversations, you can speak with clarity and confidence about the provision you've tried to put in place. There's some guidance for parents down there. There's also lots of other things you can find online. If you search for permanent exclusion, send advice. Quorum, for example, do some great work on it, but we haven't got time today to go through that in huge detail. So I've just rattled through that process there for anyone who's got concerns about it. So strategies for support. Number one is assessing what the needs are. So if we have a young person who may not currently have any SEND registered as something that they need to be supported with, is there an unmet need? Have we looked at what these behaviors that are challenging are functioning for that young person? Are they supporting that young person to escape from situations they find very challenging and difficult, for example? And what can we do to support an assessment of that young person's unmet needs to make absolutely sure that if an exclusion is possible, that it's not due to a fact that they have a special educational need that isn't being addressed? So part of that, those of you on the call that are SENCOs or teachers will have heard, hopefully, of an assess, plan, do, review. And that is that cycle that we are always updating about what adaptations, so reasonable adjustments, we would call them under the Code of Conduct, what adaptations and interventions are we implementing to support that young person? Anyone at risk of exclusion should have an assess plan do review, whether or not we understand that they have an SEN need. We should, if they're at risk of exclusion, they should have a plan like this. And we should be monitoring the effectiveness of the interventions we're putting in place to see if we are keeping up to speed with what's happening on the ground. Next, we have the environmental factors. Okay, so very often support staff and teachers and everyone working with young people who have SEND may have a varied understanding of their needs and a varied level of training and support. So what level of support have we given all of those adults and involved in supporting that young person? Do we have a risk assessment that is based around the behaviors that challenge, so that all staff who might have to interrupt and support that young person to re-regulate and to take a safer, more pro-social decision at a time when they might be exhibiting challenging behavior, do all staff understand that? And do they feel confident in the risk assessment? Have they read it? Do they understand it? Do they feel like the risk is being reduced by it? So I would say that's really fundamental. If we have staff and adults that are working in a state of panic or lacking in confidence, then that is when situations can escalate unnecessarily. Have we looked at our classroom and our environments? And we have, later on, my colleague Jake, who is supporting the chat, will be linking to the resource hub, where there is lots of support for you guys as educators and parents as well to understand what this looks like. So are we auditing our classroom and environments for potential risks to young people, particularly with ASD, who might find sensory situations overloading or communication not working for them, but for all learners as well, are the environments working? I've talked about ordinarily available provision. There is a huge amount of information available about this. Your local authority will have a recommended program for ordinarily available provision. There are other support charities that look at ordinarily available provision, but we also do have an offer for supporting schools to develop their ordinarily available provision. And how are those adaptations affecting all? You know, if there is a way that we can support our learners with additional needs that has no negative impact and potentially a positive impact on the rest of our learners, then why aren't we doing it? And really, that's what ordinarily available provision is about. Is if we are making modifications, you know, for one learner, can it be a blanket approach that supports everyone? Because that's going to promote inclusivity and reduce the risk of those with SEND feeling alienated or not having their needs met. And just lastly here, coming to communication and behavior policy. So where we have a policy in a school setting where we have potentially very strict behavior expectations. Now that might be the choice of leaders within that school, but does that policy, does it have it built in an understanding that some learners with SEND will struggle potentially with such definitions? And is there a potential for a differentiated behavior policy where those that it's not a level playing field, that find certain expectations more difficult, are given an opportunity to address that and to be supported to meet the expectations of the school in a way that's fair and balanced and supports the positive outcomes for all? If we have a blanket approach to something like, for example, just plucking it out of the air, sitting still, then we know that there are going to be a range of learners in each class that find that either easy or difficult. So that's not being inclusive. That is by definition excluding those that find that more challenging. So that's just a very quick overview of those factors. And moving on again, now looking more at the kind of reactive strategies that we might implement for support. Are we being curious, not furious? Never be certain about why something has happened and why a young person has done something that they've done. Are we asking questions? Are we gaining, the next point, pupil voice? What can the young person tell us? And how are we asking them? Are we asking them in a way that works for them? For example, if you have a young person who has a potentially PDA and you ask them in front of the class why they've behaved in a certain way, you're going to get a very different outcome than if you have them, you know, if you take them aside or you come to see them one by one and say, you seem very upset in that moment. Is there anything that I can learn about what happened, you know, that I can help you with next time? You're going to get very different outcomes. So how are we asking for pupil voice? Considering RAG rating. So what that means is red, amber, green, looking at their day with the young person. And parents and carers that are listening, you can do this right the way throughout the day. How do you feel about getting up in the morning? How do you feel about breakfast? How do you feel about brushing your teeth? How do you feel about getting to school? Learning about that, you will get a picture of the young person's entire day, and you will start to understand where potentially the anxiety and behaviors that challenge start to build from. So once again, and that's our Beyond Autism approach, is about using data and analysis to understand the problem and try to address it. Multi-agency approach. So once again, have all necessary professionals and stakeholders been spoken with? Are there professionals that have information about the situation that can support? And are we working together to provide those strategies for the educators and parents and carers alike to get the best outcome? And just a quick note, obviously, all actions should pass through a safeguarding filter here. Are we thinking about the young person's safeguarding interests when we think about the provision that we're offering them? So very quickly, because I know I'm very quickly coming to the end of our session. I haven't spent time on questions. So alternatives to PECs. What does your local authority offer? What support can they offer? Now that varies from local authority, so I can't speak with confidence here, but there definitely will be something. So do look that up. Have you looked at outreach? So if you have a multi-academy trust, is there outreach within that trust or external, which is what we do? Is there an external organization you can bring in to help you bring in expertise, knowledge, or just a fresh pair of eyes about what's going on? So, and I say this with a very, unfortunate, it sometimes does happen, but it would always be a last outcome. Is there a fixed term exclusion or a part-time timetable in a short term whilst we investigate the causes of behavior that we can implement? A fixed term exclusion, while still an exclusion and still a sense of rejection for that young person, is better than a permanent exclusion. And if you're using that time to address what happened and how we can learn from it, then at the very least, that young person can come back and it can be explained how things can be improved moving forward. And then lastly, is there an alternative provision that could offer respite support towards integration? So if there's an alternative provision that you can offer with that young person, is get some time to address a specific need each week. And how does that build in very, very importantly to their understanding and their support within the school, not just about going away to have something done and then coming back fixed, as it were, right? If they're going away to an alternative provision, how does that feed into their provision in school, on the school site? Very last resort, blended or a home learning offer. If you've got young people who are self-excluding, how are we reaching out to them? We cannot wait for them to come to us. If they're not able to attend school and they've made that clear, what is your approach, and are you offering some way of bridging that gap and getting them back in and helping them understand that they are welcome and wanted? Off-site direction is a very last resort, sometimes used by schools. They have the head teachers have the power to do it, to direct a young person off-site to address certain behaviors for a period of time. And also a managed move where we might move someone to a different school with the support of parents and carers and the young person, because we feel that for whatever reason, relationships are broken down or the environment is not suitable. That's a better alternative than a permanent exclusion, which stays on that young person's record. So that has been a very quick whistle-stop tour. And I realize I've got 2 minutes now for questions, so I'm going to whiz through the summary. Exclusion doesn't just mean PECs. There's lots of gradations to it. The earlier your work begins, the higher the chance of success. Exclusions leave learners feeling rejected, and it results in worse outcomes across the board. If you look into the data, everything should be done to avoid it. There is help available. Speak to your MAT, speak to your local authority, speak to us at Beyond Autism, and plan for a journey of improvement. Okay, it's about an environment and a situation across your setting that supports learners. So now I will go to the questions that I have. We have got. So I've got some questions about whether or not the PowerPoint will be available. And it seems that we don't have any specific questions, which is great. I feel a lot better about rushing through now. But just to be said, first of all, our next session, which is on supporting learners who mask, is on Friday the 20th of June with one of my outreach consultants, Carrie, and Francesca as well, a behavior analyst at Beyond Autism. So that will be really exciting as well. And if you scan that QR code, then you can email us and contact us. We are available to discuss these situations and issues. And we are very keen, as I said, our central goal is to help prevent the placement breakdown and exclusions of young people with ASD and communication needs across the education sector. So please do reach out to us and ask for help if you need it. Parents, carers, educators, anybody involved with learners with ASD. Links to the resource hub are in the chat. And yeah, if there's anything I've said today that you would like more specifically articulated, please just do email me at matthewmalone@beyondautism.org.uk, or the outreach emails you can see on the screen. Thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. And okay, I've got a couple of questions. Let me see. Right. So if an EHCP is not being implemented, and if that is your opinion as a parent, then you would need to, you should speak to your local authority and ask for an early annual review. But first speak to your school and say, and address your concerns and ask them to address them. But if you then feel that it's not being delivered, then you can speak to your local authority caseworker and say, I would like to discuss the provision that's being offered at this setting. That was very quick. I think we have run out of time now, so I'm going to stop. Thank you very much. Please email me any further questions you have. It's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful rest of your day.